characteristics of life, because, you know, life, not life as in life is hard, but life in general as what determines what's alive and what's not, right? So, have you guys ever heard of the word abiotic or biotic before? Or does it sound like something super new? Biology is defined as the study of life, right? Bio, because life. So if something is biotic, do you think it's alive? Whenever we think about the word biotic, it's something that's living. Or it doesn't necessarily have to move, but it's considered living. And when you hear something that has an A in the front, abiotic, it means it's non-living. Doesn't mean it's dead, but it just means that like the thing itself does not meet the characteristics of life, which we're going to go over today. So something that is living is biotic. Most of the time in biology, I can switch between biotic or living. I mean, I can go back and forth, and I'll probably also refer to things as abiotic as well, just to say like this thing is non-living. Take these pictures. This is the picture of the sky. Here's some yeast, some mushrooms, some rocks and some water, some fishes, some grass, and a flower. So, technically speaking, is the sky considered abiotic or biotic? Like technically.
Abiotic.
Right. What about yeast? Have you guys ever baked bread before? I know that was like a big thing when COVID happened, but do you guys are like, has anybody ever made bread or done anything with yeast before? And it kind of stinks. So often yeast is activated by any sugar that is present. So whenever you put sugar in any bread mixture that needs to rise, it's living. So it's going to be like, yeah, let's multiply and reproduce and get bigger. Yay. That is considered biotic. That's correct. Let's see. What about these rocks and the water? Can I be considered biotic or abiotic for that?
Abiotic?
Yes. Good. Awesome. So the fishy, the grass, and the plants, I actually used to think that plants were not living. And then I learned, like, despite that it doesn't really move or talk or anything, it's still living because it can die. And I actually have a terrible habit of taking care of gardens, so don't leave me in charge because I'll forget about it and it'll die. So don't leave me in charge of any garden. So what are these characteristics of life, right? Like what defines something that is considered living? Like what kind of criteria do I need to meet in order to be considered alive? So the big thing is that all living things are made of cells. So everything that I have right now on my face, on my fingernails, anything that's on me has cells on the inside as well. So living things are all made up of cells. Like that's the big one. Like that's like the most basic thing you need to meet. Like you need to be a cell. So unicellular, meaning one, are made up of one cell. So there are some organisms out there that only have one cell, pretty microscopic. Multicellular organisms, hello, that's us. That would be something that's made up of more than one cell. And cells that are considered the smallest unit of any organism, and it's considered to be alive. So like this is just a basic criteria. We just need to have cells in order to be considered living. Say hi to this little bacteria. They're everywhere. So number 2, everything reproduces. That's living anyways. Living things will reproduce. So there's 2 types of reproduction, unfortunately. There's sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Oh yeah, fair warning. Sometimes I'll talk about like sex in the terms of reproduction. So my apologies, because that's usually the most awkward thing to talk about at your age. But it's just a thing that we talk about. And the way I just define it is like, well, it's just biology. So we don't have to get into the birds and the bees. It's just a basic thing that happens in nature. So for sexual reproduction, I'm mixing genetic material between 2 members of the same species. No, like you cannot just crossbreed random species together and make a thing. No, they need to be the same species at least. And asexual reproduction is offspring that is genetically identical to the parent. So they do not have different genes, they're all the same. Fun fact, plants have sex. It sounds funny, but they do. I just want to make sure that everybody gets it and I'm not like bam, 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 bam. So here we'll have an example of a sperm and an egg, and it's a microscopic picture. And here, technically, this is an example of like how some bacteria actually reproduce. Sometimes they just asexually reproduce and they just make a split copy of itself. So we're going to get into it later about what it means to reproduce and how that affects genetics, essentially with DNA. It gets kind of fun, but also complicated because it's not just like the 1, 2, and it's done. It's like, no, we need to go through a checklist in order to make sure everything's okay. Okay, number 3. All living things are based on universal code. So because reproduction is all about making sure that there's genetic material present, this means that basically we all need to have DNA. So the universal genetic code is just really known as DNA. So every organism that can meet this criteria has complicated information that tells it how to live, grow, and reproduce. So it just needs to follow that basic criteria. And all the information is written within DNA. And the DNA can be found in all cells. So each cell has a specific code of DNA that it needs to follow or else. So DNA is pretty cool. And what's interesting is that it wasn't that long ago that the double helix was discovered. 4, all living things grow and develop. So you and me, we weren't just like babies forever, right? Like we eventually grew up to be big and we're gonna getting big and old. But essentially everything that lives needs to grow up and develop. So mostly during development, a single egg will divide and divide and divide until it can't. And often new cells are created to differentiate or to do different parts to better function as time passes. So part of the reasons why we as humans are able to grow is because technically we keep making more cells and more of those cells need space. So that kind of is one of the reasons why it helps us grow. It's one of the reasons why we're able to get tall or we stay a certain height. But over time, as time goes by, our functions as far as growing stop, and eventually certain cells stop growing as well, because that means we're growing old. So yeah, some fun facts about cells there. And I'll go into detail later as far as like which cells live the shortest and which cells live the longest. Number 5, all living things obtain and use energy. So right now I'm drinking this warm cup of coffee because I need to wake up. But for the most part, every living thing needs to obtain some use of energy. For us, that's eating. For plants, that's absorbing energy from the sun in order to grow. So energy can be used to grow, develop, or reproduce, depending. And another way to say that we are attaining our energy is through metabolism. And metabolism is just how we use up that total energy in our body. So here, technically, we have this wonderful thing called cellular respiration, and it's going to come back a little later. But essentially for plants, they absorb the energy from the sun, and they actually go through this process to make energy in the mitochondria to make ATP, which is the fancy way of saying energy. So this stuff comes back, and it's the same for humans, but with a little bit of a variation to it. Number 6, living things respond to stimulus. So have you guys, okay, so I'm new to Canada and I'm still experiencing winter, but something that I realized when I would go into warm classrooms is like when I would wear like a fuzzy sweater and I would touch something and I would get static shock and it would hurt because of the dryness of the air. I'm responding to stimuli there because it hurts. It's something something that would happen a lot, and then actually, for the most part now, I try to avoid things that are fuzzy or can cause a lot of static. So all living things respond to stimuli. So that means that you're responding to something to help improve your chances of survival, or in this case, to improve your chances of not getting hurt. So when you think about it, it's your body's natural response to essentially protect you, because you don't want to do something that hurts, right? Or when you're hungry, you don't want to ignore your body's cue to be like, you need to eat now, because otherwise it becomes hangry. So essentially, every living thing needs to respond to a specific thing. In this case here, right now, we have this fishy that's hiding in the ocean to kind of camouflage and protect itself from a predator. So every living thing has a way of responding to the stimulus, essentially. It's kind of important in order to survive. All right, number 7. All living things maintain homeostasis. So homeostasis is essentially the fancy word of saying how I keep myself stable. So every living thing has to maintain a stable internal environment. So we have a perfect set of conditions that we must meet, or else. And I really do mean that, or else. So we sweat when it's hot because we're releasing heat, because it means that our bodies are starting to overheat. So we have to sweat it out to cool down. When we feel hunger or thirst, it means like, yeah, no, I'm out of energy, so that's why I need to eat. So more often than not, when we're sick, one of the reasons why a fever feels so uncomfortable is because our bodies are fighting to maintain homeostasis. So the fever is essentially a cool down effect to keep ourselves stable. If our bodies did not do that, it would eventually overheat and we die. So there's actually a limited capacity of how hot the body can get. So for us, I believe we're at 37 degrees Celsius, we're stable. And anything that kind of goes up is considered a fever. And I believe getting near 40, like in the upper 40s, is already considered critical and you need to go to the hospital. So yeah, that's actually something super important. I think for the most part, if you guys ever experience a fever, it's not great. It feels like you're not really there. It just feels like not a good time. So yeah, homeostasis is a big one. I think for humans, it's pretty easy. Just more like if we're hungry or thirsty or sleepy, we respond to that right away, right? So yeah, homeostasis, my favorite word. And then lastly, all living things evolve over time. So this could be as a group, but living things evolve. So as a group here, we technically don't evolve like overnight or next year or the following year. It means more like within generations we'll eventually change, or there's something that will happen where it's no longer needed. So when we talk about evolution, we're really going to talk about what are we inheriting from our parents and what doesn't change. And number 2, how does those genetic traits help us survive over time to eventually either keep changing and improve, or just keep sending out the same genetic material over to our essential later generations, right? So whenever we think about dinosaurs, most people thought like, oh, dinosaurs, they were so huge. Well, the fun fact about dinosaurs is that they evolved to the point to stay small. Technically, their genetic cousin is a chicken. So that's why chickens kind of chase you everywhere, because they're actually the genetic cousin of dinosaurs. I personally don't like birds, so I try not to go near a pack of like chickens. Birds are scary to me, so yeah. So basically, we all need to evolve. We technically have evolved in some small way. For example, if my appendix were to explode right now, because I still have mine, it's not life and death per se. Like, I'm good, because over time, humans have been able to survive without an appendix. Even though we're born with it, doesn't mean it's necessary. So we're going to talk about that more later as we go through evolution, because then we're going to talk about like what structures are not really important anymore. And if you guys kind of, I don't know if you guys know that, but like we have a tailbone. That's also not really important because do we have tails? So that's kind of one of the fun things about evolution. Okay, so here's a couple of specimens. We got some feathers, we got some fire, we got a beam, and here we have, this is a virus. Now, for the virus, what do you guys think this could be? Would it be, do you consider a virus to be living or non-living?
Non-living.
Yeah. So the virus itself is non-living. I used to think it's a living thing because it has DNA. It does respond to its environment because of what a virus needs is to find a host. They're like a little parasite. So viruses can do, they're tiny, but they have DNA. They reproduce inside your body because that's what they need, but they're not necessarily considered a cell. They can evolve, which is kind of scary because that's what viruses do over time. They find a way to evolve. I try to keep COVID-19 talk to a minimum, but it's when it comes to viruses like that, what's fascinating about it, not really because a lot of people have died, but it has evolved to the point where it keeps having variants. So yes, while it meets the characteristics of life per se, it doesn't fully meet them because it cannot live outside of a person or animal per se. Like in order for it to be considered living, it needs to be able to do things independently, and a virus cannot do that. So, fun fact about that. I'm probably going to talk about viruses more in depth too later, just because we're going to be talking about DNA codes. So we have to begin science with an observation. What can I see? What can I assume from this and from what I'm seeing? So the observation is the first step of the scientific method. In any lab experiment, often when you're doing the process, you need to observe what's going on. Like you need to pay attention to well, is this looking any different? Does it change color? Has it changed? Can it change color? What do you see? What this helps you do is it helps you gather the information to see what can happen over time. From here, I can actually create some data because I'm gathering information based on what I see. So sometimes when I do experiments, or I might ask you to do an outdoor experiment, this is biology, so a lot of the things that happen can happen on the outside because it's life. So a lot of what you see, it can be considered just data. It doesn't need to be numbers or graphs. It can just be general information of what you see. So there's two types of data here: quantity and quality. So quantitative data and qualitative data. So the way I kind of always help myself remember that, quality over quantity or quantity over quality. Tongue twister. So quantity is all about the numbers that you obtain by either counting or measuring. And the quality is the description that involves characteristics that you cannot count. So in other words, it's something that you cannot count or manipulate in some way. So it's naturally either changing in state. So the state being, is it a solid, is it a liquid, or is it a gas? Or did it change colors? So the quality, it is a characteristic. Like, for example, my hair is brown. It used to be red. That is a quality, right? Or, hey, I put this mixture and it turned into a gas. That's quality. So a quality is mostly things that we see change, but I can't count it.